Hi, I want to welcome you to Answers for Today. I'm really happy to be with you today as we got Chris down in Texas, and we're going to be talking about something that's very important that seems to have been set aside by so many news agencies, but yet infects our world not only today, but for times ahead of us. Of course, I'm talking about the UAE deal that Netanyahu talked about here recently. And he says it's based upon strength, and it's going to yield true peace with the Palestinians. And Chris, as before we get in even to this article, I'm looking at the Times of Israel and various articles that we're looking at. I'd sure like you to give us a background, give us some understanding what this deal is all about. What does it mean to us? What does it mean for our Bible prophecy? And see if we can, here in this short half-hour program, that we could give people an understanding the impact of this deal. First of all, I want to welcome you to the program and then have you jump right into it.
Well, thanks, Terry. It's good to be with you as always. And because since February, we've had our hands full with this whole COVID thing. But what a lot of people don't realize is the peace plan that had been long awaited was actually unveiled by the Trump administration, and we were able to get a good look at it starting in January of this year. But then everything happened with the pandemic, and people's eyes were off of this. So what we know, obviously, what had been taking place while everybody is preoccupied with the virus, behind the scenes, they were trying to work on this. And I remember when I was still in California, we took a good long look at this peace plan. And I remember at the time just being completely set back in my seat at the approach that this was. And so the intriguing part of it was to read the details inside the peace plan. And so when I heard the news break that the UAE was going to become a signatory to this, it instantly flashed in my mind, oh my gosh, they've been at work at this thing for this, all these months. They've been working on this thing behind the scenes. And when they started to put together the details of it and explain what was taking place, it was obvious that it was based upon the model of this peace plan. And then, seeing what Netanyahu says, there are some things that are said for public consumption, and the idea about peace with the Palestinians and all the rest of that, that's always supposed to be the end goal to this. But you had the obvious reaction of the people like Mahmoud Abbas in the Palestinian Authority and Hanan Ashrawi, the people that you always expect that are, no matter what happens, it's always bad. And if it's favorable to anyone, it's always a bad thing. It sounds a little bit like our political system here as well. But I find it really fascinating that this puts the United Arab Emirates in kind of the same position that both Jordan and Egypt have been in with Israel for decades. And when you read the details, you can see this is already starting to take shape. And I'll be happy to fill in those blanks about what's so different about this one.
Well, Chris, I'd just like to refer back to this article that I'm reading from the Times of Israel. It says the agreement reached with the UAE, first peace deal with the Arab state for 26 years, is unlike those with Egypt and Jordan, the other two Arab states, to have formal ties with Israel. He says it's different. This is Netanyahu saying it. It's different from those that preceded it in that it was based on two principles: peace for peace and peace through strength, Netanyahu said. Under this doctrine, Israel's not required, and I think this is key, Israel's not required to withdraw from any territory together. The two countries openly reap fruits for full peace, investment, trade, tourism, health, agriculture, environment protection, and many other fields, including defense. Oh, Chris, this is a whole different look at their peace plan, where they're starting to look at the pocketbook, aren't they? They're trying to look at things in a whole different way. Say, hey, everybody else is, getting rich. Everybody else, countries are doing well. Let's bring in the tourism. Let's bring in investments. Let's bring in trade and allow that to be our common denominator, if I I've just taken a cursive look at what's being said. Why don't you fill in the blanks for everybody and give us a little better understanding of this?
Well, Terry, bravo to you, my friend, because you saw exactly what I saw when I looked at this thing in January. And I'll just put it into the words that I had said to the congregation back there and what went on in my head when I first read it. And I thought, oh, this is interesting because they're not trying to make this a political type of a peace plan. What they said is in the calculation in this, and you can read, if you read between the lines in it, it's we want to do this first. We want to make it where the nations that are willing to, in a commercial sense, have any kind of a pact with Israel will reap the financial benefits of it, and it'll have a twofold way of benefiting people. The nations that are willing to do it will have the blessings of trade, and it will be good for their economies and everything else. What it would also do to the people that are the radicals, it will marginalize them, and it could even turn the populations or the people that they control against them when they see everybody else doing well. And the people that are in the crosshairs of all of this, two terrorist organizations of Hezbollah and Hamas, for sure, and to some extent the Palestinian Authority as well, but then Iran too, when you think about it. Because the nations that have the peace plan in effect already, or that have somewhat normalized relationships, Egypt and Jordan, and now the UAE, you're going to start seeing more of the Gulf states probably do this, and that's the Sunni part of Islam. They cannot stand, they despise Iran because it is Shiite. And there is that. The only thing that usually seems to get them to agree on anything is Israel, but you're even starting to see what some would probably call the more moderate or the pragmatic people who look at Israel as less of a threat to their existence than the radicals in Iran. So,
Chris, you touched on something that even within when you talk about the different Shiites and the different type of factions, you like to think that they're all happy campers, but there's actually great divisions among the different we would want to call denominations per se, but there's great in fact they'll go to war against each other.
Oh, they've been doing it forever. I mean, the Iran-Iraq war was Sunni on Shiite, though you had a large majority, you had a majority of the people living in Iraq were themselves Shiite, but Saddam Hussein was Sunni. And so there was just this incredible hatred between Iran and Iraq, and it still exists today. But just so that people understand this, because it really does help people maybe understand a little bit about who might line up and who might be the ones that would contest this. The people who are living within the borders of Israel that are non-Jewish, that are the Muslims, are going to hate this thing if you're in the West Bank or if you're in Gaza. The radicalized, and especially the Shiites, will absolutely despise this as well. But if you realize this too, that more than 4 out of 5 Muslims on the planet belong to to Sunni Islam. And the difference between Sunni and Shiite is very simply, at the death of Muhammad, who is going to take over leadership? Would it be his son-in-law Ali, or would it be basically his right-hand man, Abu Bakr? And Abu Bakr had the following, if you will, and so he was able to take that on, and he's the heir apparent. So there's this never-ending fight between the two factions within Islam that happened from the very beginning when Muhammad died.
Well, Chris, we have a few maps that will help everybody. I think these visual maps, actually one that we'll put up from 1947, and we have these 2 other maps. Why don't you walk us through, why don't you explain a little bit what we got going on here?
Sure. It's a fascinating thing when you look at it, because there's going to be an expansion if this ever sees the light of day the way that they want it. It would expand a little bit of what we call the Gaza Strip, which is in the most southern western portion of Israel, and it borders up to Egypt. This expands it both to the east, to the southeast, and then a little bit north along the Mediterranean coast. But it also, if people can think about how Israel divides and it comes down in that sliver, the border between Israel and Egypt would have a number of other developments that would go right along that border, mainly industrial. They would find a way either overland or underland to be able to connect what is known as the West Bank with the Gaza Strip. So they want to give this two-state solution. And when you take a look at it on most maps today, you look at the West Bank, quote unquote, or Judea Samaria, and you're going to see it outlined like it's just a straight border and everything on the other side of that border is non-Jewish. Well, this basically splits even that up. It has the same basic outline, but you can see that there's pockets that would both be part of the Palestinian state and the state of Israel, and people would have the freedom to pick and choose where they would want to live and to what citizenry they want to be a part of. So it's more than just ambitious, but they have put the economic stuff up front, and they said we'll deal with the political stuff down the road. And that's what's different about it than anything else that's been attempted, because it's always land for peace and it's always political, and they aren't even talking about how it would have some financial impact. So when you read this, your first impression is you're going to look at it and say, this is a business proposal. This is exactly what this is. And so when you look at these maps that you're going to put up, and you put them and overlay them with the 47 armistice, you'll go, goodness, this looks just like what the UN proposed as far as land, but they never thought of it in the sense of making it a business proposition.
It took them just a few years to get it, didn't it? Yeah, Chris, I understand this high tech down by Egypt. They're going to build some, that's pretty much all desert down there, as I recall, but I haven't been over that area of the nation. But apparently there's some way they could build that out. And is that going to be like their Silicon Valley, per se, where they're going to build things, you think? Or have you got any insight on that?
Well, you can see that's what they want to do is industrial, but it would belong to the Gaza Strip part of it. So it would be part of what would be the, quote, Palestinian state. And the whole premise of this is let's make them self-sufficient so that they're not always having to ask for a handout from someone else or have to have it go through Israel. And this is what they think is the hook. If we can get them totally self-sufficient, they may not want anything to do with their, quote, leadership any longer. And even that's written in to the, how do you deal with that faction that just says we won't budge? They've got that figured out as well. And
they're just going to move them out if they don't budge. Is that what kind of? Because hey, the regular people are making money. They're moving forward, and they're not going to stand with this kind of leadership. Well, guess what you're saying?
That's exactly the plan. And so it's that you can get on board or you can get left behind. It's your call.
So if you carve up the land a little bit, Chris, now, what about the functionings of the governments and the taxes and paying and all that? Let's just go back and look at that map again. As Gaza opens up their border, the people who choose to live in that high tech or that residential agricultural land, now are they beholden? Once was Israel. Now are they beholden to the governments and the rules and regulation of whoever's running the area of Gaza? Is that what we're looking at?
Right, and they're trying to make it much more of a modern government, which, the people always talk about the Palestinian government and all the rest of it. They don't have one of those. They have nothing more than Yasser Arafat in a suit in the men of Mahmoud Abbas. So there's no functioning government. And this calls for develop your own constitution, your own voting for your people. And, it tries to put together an entire nation state. And interestingly enough, it's being done through the eyes of commercial things rather than through political things, because they figure that if you could take care of the economics of it, then you will shove out the radicals and the normal people wanting to just have a life will rise up. And that seems to be the way that they're proposing this, and they say as much. There are a couple of very important things. They flat out say Hamas and Hezbollah and the factions within Fatah and those that you find inside of the Palestinian Authority, straight up, they are terrorists and they're the problem, which, nobody's ever said that.
So Yeah, I was going to say that's news right there that they're identifying them as terrorists. So let's go out of Israel. Why don't you give me the mindset of as you go up to the over to the UAE and you find out what's going on there? They had a really different shifting of gears, and how are they being accepted by doing this deal by the rest of their neighbors? This is a pretty bold for the Arab nation to be able to take this on.
Yeah, and they're in a, relatively speaking, they're in a pretty safe part of the world for this type of thing. If I was just to surmise, I would guess that there are a lot of those countries that are saying, let's see what kind of backlash they get, because I think they'd like to get on board with this. But they also find that if they could find a unifying way to marginalize Iran, Iran's the threat to everyone in the whole area, especially if you're Sunni. So if you're a Sunni Muslim, so think Saudi Arabia, and that's where the UAE is, and Kuwait and all that, they're in the Gulf. You get on the other side of it where Yemen is, you see the problems that are there. Yemen is Shiite for the most part, and they're aligned with Iran, but the people that align themselves with Iran are getting smaller and smaller and more marginalized, and that's what this is intended to do. So if you could strengthen those that are more politically opposed to Iran and having normalized relationships with Israel, Israel is really the economic power in the area. And it will be much more so as time goes on, as they're developing more of oil and natural gas and all of their high tech and all the rest. So it's basically looking at the surrounding, unless you're in the royalty of those places, you're not necessarily doing so well, even in places like Saudi Arabia or the UAE. And this is a way of trying to say, to use the terms that we've used here in this country, that a rising tide lifts all boats. That's kind of the premise behind this. It's a capitalist looking at how do you bring peace to an area that's so factionalized and so tribal.
Chris, one of the things that Netanyahu was really speaking about, he was referring back to the 2015 nuclear deal and the fact that this is their major threat to the area is a fact that we just heard recently where President Trump was once again wanting to elevate or rise back up the sanctions on Iran. Those are the real threats. And if I'm a neighbor of Iran, I want to do everything I can to try to disarm these guys or I'll slow them down, because who knows what those crazies are going to do, right?
Precisely. And that's really that's the elephant in the room that you see. And you can tell that Iran is really, that's the one group that they want to cripple faster than all others. And so not a lot of dependency on anything coming out of Iran, but they figure that the stronger the surrounding nations become and the more aligned they become, then the more pressure it puts on Iran. And they don't come out and say it, but I think Trump would have had a different reaction than Obama did in his years when there was the uprising that took place in Iran. And at that time, with Obama, we turned our backs and did more and more silly things about the nuclear deal and giving them money and the stuff that happened in the last administration. If it was done in the Trump administration, would have probably looked a lot different. Because what Trump does is sees Iran as an existential threat to really all of humanity, but certainly to the region, and the people in the region agree with that. So this proposal, it's worked out with a number of other people in that area. But to see one of the first countries, the first since Jordan in almost 30 years, to normalize with Israel is a significant thing, though the UAE is a small area. But man, if you get somebody like Saudi Arabia to jump in, or Lebanon, who's already spoken about the potential of doing that, this starts to put a lot of pressure on Iran and Syria and the radicals within Israel, within the Palestinian Authority, and within Hamas.
Chris, one of the great mysteries over there, of course, why everybody's has their eyes so much on it, is their oil reserves that they have over there, and which is worth billions and billions. Who knows how much it's actually worth over there? And yet we know, for biblically speaking, that there's going to be something that's going to draw Russia into the story of what's going on. Have you seen anything what Russia thinks about this deal and what their thoughts on this?
Well, you can lay out some pretty plausible scenarios. You know who the participants are. You certainly know that right now in our world today that Russia is heavily allied with both Iran and with Syria bordering Israel. And the other part of it is that Russia's economy is not doing so well because people are starting to find workarounds from Russia. And Russia's biggest export is energy. It's oil and natural gas in particular. Well, they just found an incredibly massive deposit that Israel has now off of the Mediterranean coast. And so, but this is that cup of trembling thing that Zechariah spoke of, I'm sure, in some part. But they're also finding large oil deposits. So in a perfect scenario, imagine like kind of a 1-2 punch as far as Russia is concerned, is that they want the natural resources, but they also have military alliances with both Iran and Syria. But Iran is behind Russia, the second of the protagonists in the Ezekiel war that he mentions in 38 and 39. So you can look at the things taking shape in the world. You could say, I can give you about, 3 or 4 very plausible scenarios that could bring Russia into a conflict in the area, but it's God who draws him in and brings him against Israel with the other coalition.
Mm-hmm. So when you look at this deal, which is, I think it's amazing, the work behind the scenes that President Trump's administration had their hand on, but yet nobody seems to even give President Trump any credit towards it at all, what he's able to do, because we haven't been able to see any peace over there. We haven't been able to see any hope at all in Israel, but now yet this seems to be very, very hopeful. Chris, why don't you comment on that? And then give us a little bit of understanding how, I know you mentioned Ezekiel, how this could happen with Russia. Is this peace deal have anything that you could see concerning our biblical prophecies moving forward?
I'm glad you said that, because there are so many people that have looked at this and they've said, maybe Trump is the Antichrist because this is the peace deal that we've been waiting for. Or they said Jared,
that's funny.
Yeah, or it's Jared Kushner or somebody like that. And I just said flat out, I don't see this as being that peace plan or that, what the Antichrist will end up putting together. But what I think you have in this is the template that will be used by who that person is. The idea of doing this.
Very interesting.
To me, it's just, obviously, I think man is too clumsy to pull something like that off. But I just think that, especially since it has to be done in such short order during the tribulation, that you have to have something in place that is a workable solution. And everything that they've tried before, dividing up the land, never works. So what you can find in this is if it continues to have what they want to have happen, it will so marginalize the people that Russia is allied with. And if it, with all of this commercial success that Israel would have through this, plus the natural resources just discovered, it could very easily bait them in to coming and doing it, because these are the people that are on the outside looking in. And it's, to me, a fascinating thing. Again, Trump is not the Antichrist, nor is Jared Kushner or anybody that I can see that's involved with this. I just see this as being a great template for what the Antichrist will introduce, because it's so revolutionary in its approach.
Yes, I think that's kind of where we would take a look at scriptures, where it would be where, certainly upon the rapture of the church, there's going to be mass confusion. And this guy's going to come in and bring this peace, as Daniel talks about, Chris and I have talked about in previous programs about those first 3.5 years. There will be an economical structure that's going to bring everybody, I think, peace and prosperity, and they're going to be getting along. And who needs those Christians that disappeared? Everything seems to be going good. And as you take a look at this, one of the things that I find it's interesting, Chris, too, and I want to go back to this, is how Netanyahu was able to not have to give up any of the territories. That was very important to them for just a defense. They need those places where they could defend their country. Do you see that as key for Israel to keep those territories?
Sure, and I'm telling everybody, look at these maps, because really, for the most part, it only codifies what's already in existence. Because when you look at how they've cut up the West Bank, it has the same general kind of shape that you usually see in all of the maps, but you'll notice that it's dotted up with two different colors, one representing the Palestinian state, quote unquote, and the other one is Israel. So they don't have to stop doing anything because it's going to give them the areas where they already are. And I remember the hysteria when they said, oh, they're talking about carving up Jerusalem. They're only going to codify what's in place. That's all that they're doing.
That was going to be my next question. What about Jerusalem? But you're saying it's already, if you've been to Jerusalem, Chris, tell them a little bit. What's it like when you go to Jerusalem? There's various quarters, basically, right?
Yeah. When you go a little bit to the north of the Old City and certainly to the east of the Old City, you're in pretty heavily traveled Palestinian, quote unquote, territory, actually Muslim territory. So it kind of gives them that anyway, but it doesn't do any new division of the Old City. So you can read that it says that a portion of Jerusalem is going to be given to the Palestinian state, but Jerusalem is the Old City plus the suburbs. And we're talking about the suburbs mainly to the east and to the north. Or not to the east, rather, but to the to the east and to the north, which is already kind of where they are. So it helps you to understand that what they're doing is just kind of trying to deal with what's already been negotiated and settled. And then they're just going to basically be able to put a pin in those borders and say, this can be, they're only kind of semi-autonomous because people would have the freedom to travel in or out or live where they want to because they would be citizens and they could have dual citizenship. It's written right into the plan.
Wow. From time to time, Chris and I want to come onto the program here, give you an update what's going on in Israel, because I think in fact, I know it's so important for our future that we pray for the peace of Israel, that we're involved, that you pay attention to the news. A lot of times you're not going to get it in the mainline media, but Israel is very important I believe, for a world, for our future, for biblical prophecy. And so I would encourage you to tell your friends about this program and write in your questions. I know Chris would love to field any questions that you have concerning that. Again, I'll put his website up where his ministry is working out of right now, where you can contact Chris directly or contact the program here, and we'll deal with your questions concerning Israel. We didn't touch on it. One of the most key areas, of course, within Israel, and we'll do it on future programs, is not just Israel itself, but as you go closer, I always say you got to hone in on a little bit. It's the city of Jerusalem. Then when you go even tighter, you go to Temple Mount. And that's always been a big conflict. And I like to ask Chris in future programs, how does this peace plan work with the Temple Mount area? Has there been any discussion on that? And so until next time, on behalf of Chris, I'm Terry. May God richly bless you.
For information about this broadcast, or if you have any questions, feel free to mail us at Agape Chapel OC, P.O. Box 4023, Huntington Beach, California, 92647. Or you can email us at aft@agapechapelOC.org. Or visit our website at agapechapelOC.org. Until next time,